Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast, where I seek truth in the world's great books. I'm your host, Eric Rostad, coming to you from the beautiful Books of Titans studio in Franklin, Tennessee. My goal is to read 200 of the great books over the next 10 years and share what I'm learning. I'll talk a bit about each book, tie ideas together from a variety of genres, and share the one thing I always hope to remember from each of the great books. Today I'm going to cover Antigone, one of the Theban Plays by Sophocles. This is book 14 from my Great Books reading list. Well, in his introduction to these Theban Plays by Sophocles, Charles Segal says the following: Greek tragedy marks an important step in the increasingly ethical and philosophical interpretation of the ancient myths that runs from Homer and Hesiod on to Plato and the allegorizers of later antiquity. The Greek poets told and retold these myths with inventiveness, imagination, and powerful, expressive images, each in his own way. They used these tales to probe the depths of human nature and thereby shaped a body of material into which were distilled the reflection and experience of centuries. End quote. I love that as a framing device for what we're looking at here in the tragedies. We've got three main tragedy writers: Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. And so this is the middle one in terms of timeline, where Sophocles, and this is his best known work, the Theban Plays, and this one in particular, Antigone and Oedipus Rex are probably the two most famous. And so I love that framing of this is kind of the in-between point of Homer on one side and then Plato and the philosophers on the other side. So tragedy, you start to see the working out of different questions, and perhaps they're not asked. Maybe Homer kind of hinted at them. Hesiod, maybe in his telling of the Theogony, the genealogy of the gods, is telling the stories of what happened. But here you start to get the questions of why or how, and then these kind of lead to the next step of people spending the time to think about these deeply. People like Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. And so I love that idea of this being a bridge. And you really see that in these tragedies where you're starting to get these questions being answered. And it makes you question as a reader, just, okay, this is not a straightforward, presentation of this is what you should think about this topic, but there are different vantage points, and how do you reconcile those, and how do you make sense of those? And so I love the next thing that Charles Segal says is that Sophocles is asking a question in his plays, and this is the main question that we see. And so here it is: why should a man or woman of noble character and good intentions have to bear a life of suffering? One more time: why should a man or woman of noble character and good intentions have to bear a life of suffering? It's kind of that age-old question of why do bad things happen to good people? And here we've got someone I think that kind of represents each of those things: noble character and good intentions, not in perfect ways, but you have Antigone, who is the noble character, and then you have Creon, who is on the good intention side of things, and that can obviously be argued. I'm going to kind of argue on that side of things for Creon. And what's interesting is that in one of the introductions I read that the original audience of this play would have. Many people would have condemned Antigone as a bad woman. And so the play is called Antigone. My mind went right toward being behind her and kind of cheering her on the whole time. But it was interesting to read that same character, the same actions that she had could have condemned her to the audience of the original audience in Greece and Athens, where this was first performed. So perhaps another way to just kind of think of this question is to ask, who is the protagonist in this play? Who's the main character? And one way you can think about a protagonist is just who changes the most. In that case, I would have to say Creon. Creon is the king at this point, and he has set a law that no one can bury the body of the main traitor for the other side. There's just been this battle. Creon and his side have won. The two brothers, Antigone's two brothers, have killed themselves in combat. They both stabbed each other at the same time, and they both died, so they killed each other. And the brother that was on the other side attacking Thebes, his body is to be left out and to be eaten by the birds and to not have a proper burial, which is a big deal at this time. Means you can't go to Hades. It's disgraceful, but Creon is trying to make this point. And Antigone goes and buries her brother's body and then pays the penalty for doing so. And so if we ask who is the protagonist, on one hand, you would have to say Antigone, just because if she hadn't done her action, if she hadn't tried to bury her brother, then the whole plot would not have occurred. Her actions drive the narrative. But her mindset is that there is nothing larger than the family. The family unit is the main thing that exists. To the extent that at one point she says, husbands and children are expendable, but not siblings, because siblings, her parents are dead at this point, so siblings cannot be created again, whereas she could marry another husband or have other children, in kind of a disturbing statement, but just this idea that the family unit is the utmost importance. And then you have Creon on the other side, who he acts as if there is nothing larger than the city or the polis, and that is the top priority. And his side makes sense as well, because they have just come off from a big battle. If things had gone a different way, he would probably be dead. His wife and other women and children would have been taken off into slavery. All the men would have been killed. And so in terms of a existential crisis, are we going to continue to exist? They've just barely made it through. And now he's trying to set this law in place of, we're not going to do anything at all that would seem to honor the person that led this charge against us. Because if you allow that, then perhaps more people will join, and perhaps that would turn into another civil war, or it would turn into something else that could lead to a bad outcome. And so you see, maybe at a first reading, it's hard to take his point of view, but if you really think about where he's coming from, it makes sense on his side as well. So who is the protagonist here? Is it Creon or is it Antigone? And that's just kind of a fun question to ask yourself as you read through this play. They're both working from extreme positions. Antigone on the family side, Creon on the city, the politics side of things. So this is just a brilliant play, and it's one where Sophocles really makes you have to think and really decide what side do you think has the better argument? And Sophocles will answer that, and I'll get to that in segment 2, and not answering it in this is what you should think, but answering in a way of the outcome of the play that makes clear as to perhaps what he thinks. So Antigone, the play, this was the first of the 3 plays that are called the Theban Plays. This was the first one that was written. So this was roughly 441 BC. The second one, Oedipus the King, that would have been in the 420s, and then Oedipus at Colonus was around 405, 404 BC, and it was actually not performed until after Sophocles' death. So last week I talked about the 2 Oedipus plays, and then this week I'm just going to focus on this Antigone one. Now, one thing that I'm still trying to kind of grasp is that all of the introductions I read for this said this is not a trilogy, in the sense that Aeschylus's Orestia, that is a trilogy. All the plays work together, they build upon each other, and you kind of have to see them in order. This, even though they're usually combined when you get a book of these, and they're called the Theban Plays, they're not a trilogy in that traditional sense. So let me just read from the Paul Woodruff introduction onto what this means. He says this: "Do not think of them as a trilogy, however, for Sophocles did not write them to be performed together. They are not anything like the plays of the Orestia of Aeschylus, which follow a distinct, tight chain of events from bloody beginning to peaceful resolution, and were written to be seen together as presenting an almost continuous story, in which one play shows the cause, from which spring the action of the next, and in which the final play brings the cycle to a resolution." End quote. So I think that's kind of the main thing to think about, is that the Orestia was was meant to be performed together. These plays by Sophocles were not necessarily meant to be performed together, and there are pieces of discontinuity between the characters, and Creon will be one way in one play and kind of a little different in another play. So there's not that continuity. And then also Sophocles wrote them in reverse chronological order as well. So this Antigone play would have been the final, just in terms of the actions in the plays, but he wrote that one first, and so. Yeah, that they're not performed together. They can be each play could be complete in itself, and that's kind of the main thing of why it's not a trilogy. As far as time frame, this is mythology, so it's not. We can't like point back to a Creon or an Antigone. Whereas perhaps in the Iliad there is some debate on. Was there a Troy? I mean, not that was there a Troy, but did the Trojan War happen? Were these people in the Trojan War? All that. This is pointing to actions that were there. It was a myth, but time frame it would have happened before the Trojan War, just so we can kind of place where this is all happening. And the brilliance of Sophocles in telling this story is that as part of this myth, this battle that took place between Thebes and this Argive army that is attacking them, the Thebans win. And Creon decides to leave all of the bodies exposed. So all of the Argive soldiers are on the battlefield, and they are not to be buried. So in the play, we just have one character, Polynices, who is not to be buried. But the larger myth is that there was an entire army. And then as part of this myth, Theseus from Athens, the king, comes and secretly buries all of these soldiers to give them honor. And so what Sophocles does here is from that grand myth of like a bunch of soldiers, which would not make for a very dramatic tragedy play, he turns that and makes it into one soldier. He has Antigone, who he's related to, and is about to marry his son. So Creon's son is engaged to be married to Antigone. So Sophocles makes this a very personal, a very individual play of not a whole army, but one person. And so that's the brilliance of him and why this place holds so much for people who read it. As for themes, the main theme of this of Antigone is this idea of which law is most important. You kind of have three different laws battling against one another in these within these characters, and they are the laws of the city, the laws of the family, and the laws of the god. So Sophocles uses this to tell the story, and he uses these particular ideas of character, circumstances, and divine agency to tell his story. But the theme is, which law holds the most sway, or how do they work together? The law of the city, the family, or the god. I want to highlight one other thing I mentioned last week that I hadn't fully grasped what it meant, and that is that Sophocles is credited with creating the third actor. And how I thought of that originally is that that at any given time you would have three characters together. So you'd have the chorus, and then you could have three other people out there. And Aeschylus was credited with creating the second actor, and then Thespis was credited with creating the first actor. So somebody in addition to this chorus that would be telling the story. And that's correct, but what it doesn't take into account is that there were only three actors. And so we have a lot more than three people in this play. So when the play was performed, these three actors would have been all of the parts. So perhaps the main character would have just been one individual, but the other people would have been changing characters the entire time. And so these plays were performed with these kind of oversized masks over the people. So they would have just changed masks, and that would have told who the person was. But what that also means is that only three people could be out there at any given time, and that kind of that kind of limits what can happen. You can't just have all of the characters out there at the same time talking. At any given time, there can only be 3 people out there in terms of the actors. Then there's a chorus, which would be between 12 and 15 people. And in this play, Antigone, the chorus is Creon's Council of Elders. The versions I read for this, I read 3 different translations. I read the ones by David Green, Peter Minnick, and Paul Woodruff. Both of them work together on that. And then the translation by Robert Fagles for the third one. I read each of the introductions of these as well. And that's one of the reasons I get so many different copies is I end up learning a lot in the introductions. I do try to read the plays first and then go back to the introductions, but sometimes I do need to poke into the introductions first just to get a good overview of what's about to come. I have 2 more segments in this episode. The first is just, I'll highlight some ideas that stuck out to me. And then in segment 3, the final segment, I will cover the one key idea, the one thing I'm still thinking about after having read Antigone. I want to start off reading a quote here that is quite famous from Antigone. And so we'll start with what Creon is asking Antigone here. And you still had the gall to break this law. And here's Antigone's famous response. Of course I did. It wasn't Zeus, not in the least, who made this proclamation, not to me, nor did that justice, dwelling with the gods beneath the earth, ordain such laws for men, nor did I think your edict had such force that you, a mere mortal, could override the gods, the great, unwritten, unshakable traditions. They are alive, not just today or yesterday. They live forever, from the first of time, and no one knows when they first saw the light. End quote. So that is Antigone, a rather brazen and bold and courageous thing to reply to a king who has enacted this law that you cannot bury Polynices, who is Antigone's brother. And that is her response. Along the lines of, Zeus didn't make that law. Justice didn't make that law. And who are you, Creon, the king, to think that you can make a law that would override the gods? And it's an incredible thing, and people throughout history have taken these lines to apply to their particular situations. And in fact, I read a modern version of Antigone that was done in Nazi-occupied France in 1944. And so you just see Antigone being called into different scenarios that where people relate to her, and this response that man-made laws, who made them? Did they come from Zeus? Did they come from justice? And who do you think you are that you can make this other law? And Paul Woodruff, in his introduction, which I'm going to highlight that at the very end, but I enjoy the Paul Woodruff introduction very much. And in his introduction, he says this: the unwritten law against non-burial exists in her imagination. The concept of unwritten law was unheard of before Antigone, and in any case, it is legal to leave traitors unburied. End quote. So here, Woodruff is saying that this unwritten law was unheard of before Antigone. And this is an introduction, one of those things I mentioned in segment 1 where these tragedies are this bridge. And so here's the first time, at least from what has survived, that we come across this idea in Greek literature, at least, of an unwritten law. And this is where it is, the part I just read. And it's a really incredible thing to think about. And one of the beauty of these plays is that you are encountering ideas sometimes, or questions of why things are the way they are for the very first time. And maybe they were there before, and maybe it has not survived, or people were talking about these things, and he was the first person to put them down in a play. But it's a pretty astonishing thing to consider. Next thing I want to highlight is Creon and just his ideas. And here's kind of where he's coming from. He says this about anarchy. Anarchy. Show me a greater crime in all the earth. She destroys cities, rips up houses, breaks the ranks of spearmen into headlong rout. But the ones who lasted out, the great mass of them, we must defend the men who live by law. Never let some woman triumph over us. Better to fall from power if we must at the hands of a man, never be rated inferior to a woman, never. End quote. So you obviously have quite a bit of sexism in that quote, but the very first part of it, anarchy, and there's other parts of just this fear of a civil war, of that being one of the worst things that can happen, and we see that in Aeschylus as well. But Creon he's talking about these evils that if he does not protect his kingdom, he's the king. If he does not protect against anarchy and civil war, the existence of that kingdom is at stake. And that's where he's coming from. And you take his vantage point and it makes sense. You may not agree with it, you may not like it, especially in light of Antigone's responses to him, but he is coming from a place of wanting to make sure that his city is safe now that he is the king. One thing I also found really interesting about Creon is just that he continually accuses other people of bribery. He accuses the seer, Tiresias, and he accuses one of the first messengers of bribery as well. And I just wonder, I mean, it usually happens when somebody is saying something against Creon. And so whether it's just kind of like, let's deflect what is being said about me, and I'm just going to, attack the messenger, that could be part of it. But I also just wonder if Creon had something where he was taking bribery or taking bribes. It was just a kind of an interesting thing that he would always go into attack mode if somebody was confronting him with something. So who does Sophocles say was right? What does he approve of? And again, it's not necessarily written in the play of like, I think this, but based on what happens in the ending, I think we can kind of gather what Sophocles thinks about who was right. And so Antigone dies at the hands of herself, but as a result of being put underground in a cave to die by Creon. But the things that happen that are truly awful are what happened to Creon, in that he loses his son and his wife to suicide. And before his son commits suicide, he actually tries to even kill Creon. And so Creon loses everything. He loses his family for the sake of this city. And so his main goal of protecting the city, he's got the city at the end, but he has lost his family in the meantime. Antigone has fought for her family, her brother was already dead, but she has lost her life in the play. So who does Sophocles say was right? Haman, Antigone's fiance and the son of Creon, he is the only character in the entire play to praise Antigone. Tiresias, the seer, does not even mention her. And so that's another interesting thing to look at, just in terms of what did Sophocles think about these characters. Haman, since he was engaged to her, he might possibly be a little biased towards Antigone. So do we take what he says at face value when no one else mentions her or comments on what she is doing? It's just kind of an interesting way to look and read through the play. Last thing I want to do here, and one of the main things I like to do with this project, is just connect this play to other works that I've read. And the first thing I want to do with this is in a myth that is not a part of this play, but is referenced and kind of is connected to this story, and that is of Creon's elder son, Megareus. And he was sacrificed to ensure success for this battle, for this war against Thebes and Argos. And it reminds me of the story of Agamemnon, where Agamemnon he sacrificed his daughter in order to have favorable winds for them to get to Troy to initiate the battles of the Trojan War. And how that eventually was one of the main reasons that Clytemnestra ended up killing her husband because of that. And so you kind of have a callback to that. And this one wasn't as direct with Creon directly killing his son, but through circumstances, the son was sacrificed in order to ensure success for Thebes. So that was one connection point just between the story of Agamemnon and then this story of Creon and Antigone. Another connection point is the calling out of who is at fault. And in Antigone and in Oedipus the king, Tiresias the seer, the religious person, the mouthpiece of the gods, if you will, he says the same thing to two different characters. So in Antigone, he calls out Creon as being the man, the one who is doing this. And he says this, "And it is you, your high resolve that sets this plague on Thebes." That's very similar to what he says to Oedipus in Oedipus the king, where he says, "You are the curse, the corruption of the land." And so Tiresias in both of these cases points out the man. It reminds me of the David and Nathan story in Samuel, where Nathan approaches David and says, "You are the man," and just calling that person out directly. Next thing is a connection between the Iliad and this play. So the body is left out to rot and to be food. And this is how that is portrayed. And this one is the Robert Greene translation. I just like how he put this. So here's what he says. "For our altars and our sacrificial hearths are filled with the carrion meat of birds and dogs, torn from the flesh of Oedipus's poor son." So that's the quote from Antigone here. Listen how similar that is to the first part of the Iliad. "Rage, goddess, sing of the rage of Peleus, son of Achilles, murderous doomed, that cost the Achaeans countless losses, hurling down to the house of death so many sturdy souls, great fighters' souls, but made their bodies carrion, feasts for the dogs and birds." The same idea, just of bodies that are left exposed are food for the dogs and the birds. So I just that connection point between those two was quite interesting as well. And finally, I want to highlight this idea of the heroic temper that Bernard Knox, in his introduction to the Robert Fagel's translation, he comments on this. And he says this, "A heroic temper, this figure of the tragic hero, though it had a non-human predecessor in the Aeschylean Titan Prometheus, and its origin in the great Achilles of the Homeric Iliad, seems, as far as we can tell from what remains of Attic tragedy, to have been a peculiarity of Sophoclean creation. In his plays, he explores time and again the destinies of human beings who refuse to recognize the limits imposed on the individual will by men and gods, and go to death or triumph, magnificently defiant to the last," end quote. So again, you've got this connection of this heroic temper of this tragic hero, and kind of the only good thing to come out of a tragedy is this hero. And here, Bernard Knox connects that hero to Prometheus and Achilles in these other works. That's going to do it for this segment. In the last segment here, I will cover the one thing, my one key takeaway, the thing I'm still thinking about in Antigone. So in this play, you have all these different ideas, you have all these different characters, and who's right, who's just messed up from fate, can't get out of what fate has set for this person. You have all these things you're thinking about, and then you get to the end, and they're just such a moving scene and such a tragic scene that I just want to read it. And this is Creon, and this is a leader speaking, but he's speaking about Creon, who has just entered the room. "The king himself, coming towards us, look, holding the boy's head in his hands. Clear, damning proof, if it's right to say so. Proof of his own madness, no one else's. No, his own blind wrongs. And then later on, Creon says this: "Look at us, the killer, the killed, father and son, the same blood, the misery. My plans, my mad, fanatic heart, my son cut off so young. I dead, lost to the world, not through your stupidity, no, my own." End quote. And gosh, that's so hard to think about and to read this moving scene of Creon holding the head of his son in his hands and realizing that this all happened because of him. And that is just, it's such a terrifying thought that there are decisions you can make that are irreversible. And oftentimes that is dealing with the death, where there's just nothing you can do after the death. And as far as is in these tragedies, death ends it for that of being able to change directions or do something. And the incredible thing in this play is that Creon did change his mind. He did change. Back to what I mentioned in the first segment of who is the protagonist. And if you view it as who is the person who changed the most, you could make a strong argument that Creon is one that is the character that changed the most in this play. And yet he was too late. And oh man, it's a fear of mine. Just what if I do something that is irreversible, or I make a decision too late, and you just see the ramifications for that the rest of your life. Like Creon has to live with this now, that the decisions that he made, not changing until it was too late to change, he's lost everything. He's holding the head of his son in his hands. His wife has committed suicide. His other son was sacrificed for this war. He has nothing. He's lost it all. And just that tragedy, you think about it from your own vantage point of making the wrong decision, making a decision too late, and being so bullheaded that you don't change. And oh man, it's a hard thing to think about. But that's the thing that sticks in my head. Just this picture of Creon carrying his son, holding his son's head in his hand. That is tragedy. To recap, this was an incredible series, these Theban Plays. I spent over 3 weeks just heavily involved in them, reading 3 different translations. I was part of a Catherine group where we discussed each of these 3 plays over 3 weeks. And I read the introductions. I read another more modern play of Antigone from the 1940s, and just really try to get into this mindset and get into these plays. This is a work that has been studied throughout time, Antigone and Oedipus, but Antigone as well. And Aristotle mentions Antigone, and writers throughout the ages have mentioned this play. So it's one of those where you read it, and then it'll help you later on with other works. I can't wait to read Aristotle's comments about this and about Oedipus. This is just going to be amazing. And now I know this story. I didn't know this story before now. For an introduction, like if you need help understanding it, the introduction that helped me the most was the Paul Woodruff translation and introduction. So I would highlight that one, or I would recommend that one if you need some help just in understanding. I thought it was so good. One other quote I want to share. This is Creon to Antigone: "You will descend alive to that world of death." And oh, what a tragic thing to hear. What a hard thing. And there's this idea that the man Polynices, who is dead, who should be underground, is above ground, and the woman who is below ground as punishment, she should be above ground. Just that twist in that sense, and just another part of the tragedy. Actually, let me correct that. That was the chorus that said that. You will descend alive to that world of death. So I want to leave you with a question, and the question is this: do you think Sophocles changed in his thoughts about Antigone, if at all? So we've got this play Antigone from 441 BC, and then almost 35 years later, we have Oedipus at Colonus, the end of Oedipus's life and the end of Sophocles' life as well when he's writing this. And did his way that he portrayed Antigone, does Antigone change at all? I think it's a fun question to consider as you're reading through these plays. Well, late last night I started the History of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. So that's what I'm reading now. I'm just kind of putting that right in between Sophocles' plays. So I've spent 3 weeks on the Theban Plays by Sophocles, and then I will read his 4 other remaining plays after I read Thucydides. So this History of the Peloponnesian War, I've been looking forward to this one. I read Herodotus' Histories last year and just loved it. And so I'm reading the landmark edition of this History of the Peloponnesian War, which has a lot of helpful material, maps, other stories to help kind of understand what's going on. So it'll take a while, but I'm really looking forward to this one. Wanted to remind you that the podcast is now on Substack, and I'm going to begin writing there more, and then I'll be posting all podcasts from Substack. So if you would like to support the podcast, I have a $9 per month plan. So just $9 a month, and you can help support this podcast, or $99 per year. And I'd really appreciate that. Right now, I just cover all the costs of this podcast. It's a labor of love. I love doing it, and I'd be reading these books whether I was podcasting about them or not. But if you're getting value out of these episodes, I'd love if you would consider donating and supporting the podcast in that way through Substack. That's going to do it for this episode. Thank you for listening. I'd love to hear from you if you've read these Theban Plays, if you've read Antigone. You can email me at eric@booksoftitans.com. I am on Instagram and Twitter at Books of Titans, and then the new Substack at booksoftitans.substack.com. You can go to the website, booksoftitans.com, and I have a ton of resources there to help you find the good books, the great books, and to create your own reading list. I'll be back in a week or two discussing another book from this 2024 reading list. Until then, keep reading, keep learning, and keep listening. I'm out.